My name's Peter Wells. I'm an associate here at Brass. I'm also a reader at Cardiff Business School and a co-director at the Centre for Automotive Industry Research, which is also based in Cardiff Business School. For many years now I've been looking at issues of sustainability around the production, use and disposal of cars in our society, and I've become very involved in that research in terms of understanding the totality of the impact of the industry and the totality of the impact of how we use cars in everyday life. As a consequence, one of my areas of research has been looking at issues of emissions, toxic emissions into the air and so forth, and of course arising from that becomes an interest in understanding how the motor vehicle generally affects human health and happiness. And it seemed to me that whilst many people were focusing on those indirect impacts via air quality and so forth, that we were not paying enough attention to one of the most direct impacts, which is through deaths and injuries caused by motor vehicles in use. And increasingly I became interested in this area, looking to understand why it was that we still had a very high rate of death and injuries around the world, and indeed it was a problem of escalating concern, particularly in emerging markets, which were perhaps not as used to having cars in and around society, and also where car ownership rates have been growing very, very quickly. And so we had a situation where the rate of death and injuries was becoming both a national concern and indeed an international concern with organisations like the World Health Organization. So looking at those kind of issues, I started to think about, well, what are the causes of this? What are the reasons why death and injury rates are so high, particularly in certain countries compared with others? And once you start to look at this issue, you can see that there are many different explanations, ranging from looking at the condition of the vehicles themselves, to looking at the experience and skills of the drivers, to looking at issues like climate, topography, urban infrastructure, the built environment, many other aspects. In fact, it's a very, very complex problem to understand in its totality because there are so many issues to consider. So when I started thinking about these related problems, I also started to think about the issue of cultures of automobility, shall we say. That's the ways in which social practices emerge around the use of vehicles and their acceptance and their role in society. And you can see that even in a country like the UK, we have certain subcultures emerge around car ownership and use. Here in South Wales, for example, there's been a long-standing problem of young men, 16, 17, 18-year-old young men, stealing cars and so-called joyriding, often with fatal consequences. Equally, there's a fairly well-established subculture of so-called born-again bikers. That's to say, generally men in their sort of 40s, 50s, who have come back to motorcycling after many years of absence, buy much more powerful machines than they had in their youths, and tragically again, often the consequences are very dire. But what we see there is these subcultures of automobility being created around certain ways of thinking about the car and using the car, or indeed the motorbike, and the impact of that on society. Equally, having spent some time in Brazil and having experienced what it's like in Brazil in terms of the way cars are used, I realised that in a country like that, the cultural attitudes to car ownership and use, and particularly to car driving, were very, very different. For one thing, for example, Brazilians are not so concerned about drink driving as an issue. They have recently introduced a very stringent drink driving law in Brazil, but historically there was a general acceptance that drinking a bit and driving a bit was not a problem. That's one of the reasons why they have such a high death rate in Brazil, and one of the reasons why I became interested to understand perhaps more why it was that there was a willingness to break the rules. And I think that's the key thing here. All countries have rules about how you use vehicles and how they should be intermediated, shall we say, in the urban infrastructure. But not always are those rules followed. And I think this issue of rule observance, it has become one which I'm particularly keen to understand more closely, because it seems to me that, generally speaking, motor vehicle incidents are, generally speaking, attributable to human error, not to any particular fault with the machine. Drivers go too fast, they take unnecessary risks, And understanding why those risks are taken, I think, is a key element of understanding the rate of death and injuries. A few years ago, I read a very interesting little paper about the way in which delegates to the United Nations in New York acted with respect to car parking and car parking fines. Now, of course, all of the delegates to the UN are diplomats, and as diplomats, they had diplomatic immunity. That meant that they were effectively able, if they wanted to park where they liked. Now, what was interesting about this research was that it showed that different countries approached this issue very, very differently. So on the one hand, you had a country like, say, Denmark, which was, quite frankly, perfect in the sense that, firstly, the country never picked up any car parking fines, and secondly, because of that, they never had any fines to pay. At the other end of the extreme were countries like Saudi Arabia. Now, in this case, the country picked up a lot of car parking fines, but also failed to pay them. Now, that's not because they couldn't afford to pay them, they simply didn't feel the need. So here we see two very, very different approaches to the issue of the observance of very simple rules and regulations. Now, if you then transpose that concept, that different national cultures may have different attitudes towards rule observance and the compliance with then in a motoring environment, that can be the difference between high death rates and low death rates. So I then started to think about, well, where can I find a measure, a good comprehensive measure of all of the different sources of rule observance, rule compliance for all of the countries around the world? And of course there is no such measure. The only thing I could find, which I've used as a proxy, is an indicator of corruption. Now, this indicator of corruption is not intended to be used in the way in which I've used it, and that's an important proviso. But short of being able to research rule observance and behaviours in motor vehicles across all countries in the world, it was one way of getting in at the problem. So I then used that information in the form of an index of corruption as the basis to understand which countries were likely to follow rules and which countries were not. That data was then matched up against and correlated against data for road traffic deaths and injuries. And what we saw as an outcome of that was that there was indeed a correlation, and that's, I think, the most profound finding from this, that these attitudes to rule observance underpin very different outcomes in terms of deaths and injuries on the roads. Now, of course, there are many other issues involved in this. In many cases, for example, the individuals that are killed or injured are not even in the car, particularly when you look at these emerging markets. They're pedestrians, they're cyclists, they're motorcyclists, they're much more vulnerable road users, in other words. However, they are, of course, intermingled with motor vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, on those roads. And again, either the cyclists or the pedestrians themselves may be taking risks, or indeed the drivers of the vehicles may be taking those risks, and the outcomes are there to be seen. As a consequence, I think the implication of the research is that we have to think much more carefully, not just about creating rules of behaviour, and not just about creating safer vehicles, but actually about understanding how it is that those rules and those safer vehicles do not necessarily lead to safer outcomes. And that's about having a much closer understanding of the way in which the car is thought about in those cultures and the way in which risk-taking is thought about in those cultures. And that to me is a more difficult task. It's a much more holistic task. It's a much more educational task. It's about trying to persuade different subgroups within a society that they need to be more risk aware. Of course, in the industrialised countries like the UK, we've grown up with the motor vehicle over a period of 100 years or so, and that's been a relatively slow transformation. We've had a lot of painful lessons along the way, and as a consequence of that, the idea of rule compliance has become relatively strongly embedded, particularly when it comes to the use of motor vehicles in our cultures. In those cultures which have not had such an in-depth experience of the motor vehicle, and where the use of those vehicles has dramatically grown in recent years, they haven't had that time to adjust. in the totality of their system, which means that both drivers are inexperienced, but also there isn't the depth of experience in terms of the legal system, the vehicle servicing system, the police system, the medical system, all of the other parts of the society which envelop and wrap around the use of the vehicle in a particular context. So understanding that broad sense of the culture of automobility, which includes all of those different aspects, is I think a crucial ingredient to trying to reduce the already catastrophic rate of death and injuries in those, particularly in those emerging markets, which have become very, very important both to the industry itself, but also, of course, to those countries. And so I think in the future, this research could open up a lot of different doors. I mean, I'm particularly keen to pursue an understanding at a more national level, for example, either here in the UK or indeed in countries where some research experience, such as India or China or Brazil, where I think it would be important to come to a much more in-depth understanding of the cultural position of the car in those specific settings. And maybe as a result of that, we'll be able to do more towards a more comprehensive solution to this very, very difficult problem.